Fantastic. All right, we are live. Good afternoon from Boston and good evening to those of you who are in Athens. I'm Professor Elizabeth Prodromou. I'm the faculty director for the Fletcher Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. And along with Professor Constantine Arvanitopoulos, who currently holds the Fletcher Chair, the Constantine Karamanlis Chair in Hellenic and European Studies, it's our pleasure to welcome you today and most especially to welcome the Honorable Ambassador Geoffrey Pyatt today to a conversation. Ambassador Pyatt is the United States Ambassador to Greece, and Professor Arvanitopoulos will introduce him momentarily, but I do want to offer special thanks to Professor Pyatt, Ambassador Pyatt for being with us today at a time when U.S.-Greek relations and Greece is really at the epicenter of some really exciting and also sobering developments at the intersection of three continents, Europe, Africa, and Eurasia and Asia. And that's really, what's behind the title for today's talk, U.S.-Greece relations, common values, and shared interests in a time of complex diplomacy and high-stakes geopolitics in Eurasia. And we could add in, as I said, Africa, the intersection of these three continents. Before handing things over to Professor Arvanitopoulos, and once again, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, I want to remind us all of a few kind of format priorities. Number one, we're under Chatham House rules today. Number two, you can post any questions that you have in the Q&A box, and then we'll turn those over to Ambassador Pyatt. And then number three, I also want to welcome audiences on both sides of the Atlantic, the Fletcher audience and the audience at Pantheon University from the Department of International and European Studies, and also the Institute of International Relations with Professors Papasoteriou and Ifadis, and then give a shout out of thanks to the US Embassy team that made all of this possible, along with our Fletcher PhD student, Nicholas Ciccinelli. So Constantine, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. It is a distinct honor and a privilege to introduce Ambassador Pyatt, who is currently the United States Ambassador to Athens, to Greece. He has had a distinguished career in foreign service. Prior to Athens, Ambassador Pyatt served as a US Ambassador to Ukraine from 2013 to 2016, receiving the State Department's Robert Frasure Memorial Award in recognition of the commitment to peace and alleviation of human suffering in eastern Ukraine. But he has also held a number of important posts. He was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs from 2010 to 2013. He was Deputy Chief of Mission at the US Mission to the International Organizations in Austria from 2007 to 2010. And he also served at the US Embassy in New Delhi in India as a Deputy Chief of Mission. Since he joined the Foreign Service in 1989, Ambassador Pyatt also served at the National Security Council staff, on the staff of Deputy Secretary Strobe Talbot, and at various posts in Honduras and India. During his tenure in Greece, and if I'm not mistaken, he must probably be the longest serving US ambassador in Greece. He'll correct me if I'm wrong. But the traditionally good Greek-American relations really flourished during his tenure. And we are particularly grateful to him for his service in Athens. During his tenure, he launched major initiatives, and he has major achievements to present. One of them was the signing of the defense agreement the new defense agreement between Greece and the United States. But I will let him talk about all this. And again, thank you to all the staff that has helped us in that, at Fletcher, my colleagues at Pantheon in Athens, the people at US Embassy, and of course, we are indebted to the ambassador for joining us. And with no further ado, I will yield the virtual floor to Ambassador Pyatt. Ambassador Pyatt, thanks again.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Arvanitopoulos, for that very warm introduction. Thank you, Elizabeth, Professor Prodromou, for putting us all together and making this happen and framing the conversation. And of course, good evening to all of my friends and colleagues here in Athens, and good afternoon to those of you in Massachusetts. I want to say a huge thanks to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy for hosting me and for giving me this platform. And I'm really delighted, as Professor Arvanitopoulos alluded to, that we're joined by faculty and students from Pantheon University. So this is very much a transatlantic conversation. The title of my remarks today refers to complex diplomacy, and the timing could not be better because we are coming together at a moment of exceptionally complex diplomatic efforts as the United States and our allies in Europe are engaged in some really high stakes discussions with Russian leaders that will have quite lasting implications for European security and indeed for the whole world. And so it's a good moment in history to be reminded of why diplomacy matters. And certainly in that spirit, I hope when we get to the questions and answers, somebody, especially on the Massachusetts end, will ask me about careers in the State Department, which I'd be really happy to talk about as well. It's great to have an audience of people in both Greece and the United States who are genuinely interested in international relations. And I think this global focus could not be more timely or more important. As I look back on a very long diplomatic career, one thing that's become increasingly clear to me is that all of the most challenging problems that we face, the climate crisis, emerging great power competition, transformative technology, fighting disinformation, preserving our democracies, all of these challenges are going to require you as our future leaders to work collaboratively and across borders to find solutions in a way that really will transcend geographic borders. So in the next few minutes, what I want to do is share a few thoughts, then move on to questions and answers. And I really do want to hear your perspectives as well. So let's try as best we can in this virtual setting to make it a dialogue. Of course, no discussion about our common values and shared interests in Europe can take place right now without addressing the events that have seized the world's attention on the Ukrainian border, which I would point out is a country that's only about 400 miles north of Greece's northern border with Bulgaria. So I'll start with that, then review some of our key areas of focus in Greece's wider neighborhood, and then conclude with some highlights of the bilateral relationship, which demonstrate how Greece has emerged as a really key strategic partner for the United States, actively promoting security, stability, and democracy, not just in Europe, but across several regions of importance to the United States. So let's start on Russia-Ukraine. I think everybody online tonight is well aware of the United States' urgent concerns, which are shared by countries throughout Europe and globally, over Russia's increasingly bellicose rhetoric, misinformation, and the genuinely unprecedented buildup of military forces that we see on Ukraine's borders today. The intensity of US diplomatic engagement on this problem over the past few weeks is really unprecedented. Meetings led by our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, our Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, strategic stability dialogue with Russia, conversations at NATO, at the EU, at the OSCE in Vienna, are all part of a full court press on this problem. And it's a problem that goes beyond Russia's military buildup and disinformation campaign. We see Russia's actions today around Ukraine and its demands as examples of how Russia has repeatedly turned away from the agreements that have maintained peace and stability across Europe for many decades, to allow Russia to violate the principles that we have agreed to in the first decades following World War II with impunity would drag us all back to a much more dangerous and unstable time. And that's why the United States and our partners and allies throughout Europe, including here in Greece, have been so focused on what's happening in Ukraine. It's much bigger than a conflict between two countries. It's bigger than Russia and NATO. It's a crisis with global consequences and which requires global action. I should also say, as the former US ambassador to Ukraine, I would be remiss if I didn't also mention my genuine concern for the people of that country. I was ambassador in the winter of 2013 14, when the Ukrainian people stood up to defend their choice for a democratic and free European future. I have seen firsthand how difficult life has become for Ukrainians living under the shadow of Russian occupation in Crimea and aggression in Donbass and eastern Ukraine ever since. I've traveled all over eastern Ukraine. I've met with hundreds of Russian speakers who are dismayed at what Moscow has done to their country. And I've seen young Ukrainians, like many of you on the Zoom link tonight, literally risk everything to achieve the democratic freedoms, rule of law, and options for the future that most of us take for granted. So I would underline that this is not just a distant border dispute or yet another example of Russia bullying its neighbors. What's at stake are the principles that have made the world safe and more stable for decades, and the rules that have given Europe an unprecedented run of peace and prosperity. I think Greek Foreign Minister Dendias put it exactly right yesterday when he visited the frontline city of Mariupol, where Greeks have lived for thousands of years, and defended and described your country's firm commitment to the principles of Ukrainian sovereignty and international law. So the United States is hopeful that our steadfast work with allies and partners in NATO and the EU, at the OSCE, the G7, and the United Nations will make absolutely clear our shared message to Russia that it has two paths: the path to diplomacy that can lead to peace and security for all of us, or path of aggression that will lead only to untold violence, severe punishment, and international condemnation. So we all have our work cut out for us in the days ahead to counter Russia's aggression. And as allies and friends, we have to speak with a unified voice. Greece, an EU member state close to the United States and a NATO ally with a distinctive connection to the Greek-speaking diaspora of Mariupol and the Azov coast, has an important role to play. During my tenure as US Ambassador to Greece, I've been truly excited to witness this country taking a much more prominent role in its foreign policy in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Western Balkans, the Black Sea region, and beyond. And it has done so with the strong support of the United States. Over the past few years, the world has witnessed a remarkable transformation of Greece from being considered as a problem child for Europe during the worst years of its economic crisis to the role it now plays as a driver of economic growth, an example of smart governance, and a promoter of stability in a complicated and strategically important region. Let's start with the Balkans. Greece signed the Prespis Agreement with North Macedonia in 2018 under a previous government. But Prime Minister Mitsotakis has seen to it that there would be no loss in momentum in the normalization of relations between the two countries, which in turn has unlocked a much more ambitious Greek role across the former Yugoslavia. 3 years after Prespis, it's remarkable how much Greece is collaborating with its Balkan neighbors on energy security and diversification, guiding them towards Euro-Atlantic institutions and reforms, and helping advance our shared goals for law enforcement and good governance. Greece helped North Macedonia join NATO, and we've seen impressive cooperation between the two countries' militaries. Greece and its Balkan neighbors have redrawn the energy map of southeastern Europe, transforming the northeastern Greek city of Alexandroupoli into a regional hub and helping Thessaloniki to rekindle its role as a cosmopolitan gateway for all of the Western Balkans. Shared ownership in energy projects like the floating regasification unit in Alexandroupoli and the connected Alexandroupoli natural gas power plant, the Greece-North Macedonia interconnector, and deepening ties between Greece and all of its northern neighbors are opening the path for other areas of collaboration, like renewable energy and smart grids. Thessaloniki and northern Greece play a much more important role today than they did when I came to this country as a gateway to the Balkans, a market with over 30 million people. And the potential for expanding and deepening those regional economic ties is virtually limitless, as illustrated by new investments by companies like Deloitte, Microsoft, Amazon Web Services, all of which have a specific regional focus. Of course, Greece is also playing a more prominent role in the Eastern Mediterranean, With the creation of the 3+1 cooperation framework in 2019, Greece committed to work with Israel, Cyprus, and the United States to advance a shared vision for stability and prosperity in this region. The agreement has united three democracies that enjoy strong, dynamic relations with the United States, working together not only on energy, but also on several other areas of interest, including how to spur economic growth, recovering from the pandemic, counterterrorism cooperation, combating the climate crisis, mitigating illegal migration flows, and advancing our knowledge-based economies. And we share with the Greek government a vision that this cooperation should expand to embrace other regional players like Egypt. And of course, it's important in this context to mention Greece's relationship with Turkey. Greece and the United States agree that conflict between NATO allies will only benefit adversaries who seek to sow division and challenge our transatlantic ties. I've seen Prime Minister Mitsotakis, Foreign Minister Dendias, and Defense Minister Arvanitopoulos on many occasions during my tenure, taking steps to resolve disagreements and quell tensions diplomatically and peacefully. They agree with the United States that keeping Turkey anchored in the West is essential to ensuring regional stability and economic prosperity for both countries. And Greece is working on practical cooperation, like the positive agenda championed by Deputy Foreign Ministers Frasure and Onal, that will deliver concrete benefits for the citizens of both countries. But it's worth reiterating that Greece's aspirations for its foreign policy today extend beyond its relations with its closest neighbors. Foreign Minister Dendias and his team have been strategic and ambitious in their approach. Foreign Minister visited Cairo several times in 2021 to discuss bilateral efforts to promote regional stability. And he also met with the Secretary General of the Arab League. Foreign Minister Dendias visited Angola and Nigeria just in January. He hosted the Foreign Minister of India here in Athens last June. And Greece has leveraged the Abraham Accords to strengthen ties with UAE and other Arab countries in a way that the United States welcomes. These efforts all point to a rising ambition for Greece to have a more global profile and impact. Due to its strategic location and these enhanced efforts, Greece is now projecting power in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia in a way that nobody was thinking about when I came to Athens in 2016. Greece's efforts to create new transregional connections show tremendous potential. From President Biden, who's a great friend of Greece, and throughout the United States government, we strongly welcome these efforts because we know Greece is so committed to promoting our shared democratic principles, religious freedom, human rights, creating new avenues for trade, and exporting stability and security, not just to its own neighborhood, but around the world. Finally, let me say a few words about the US-Greece bilateral relationship. The United States sees eye to eye with Greece on many of its foreign policy goals and priorities because our interests are closely aligned. And because we see eye to eye on so many different areas, our ties have reached a generational high point. President Biden made clear his personal commitment to take the US relationship with Greece to even greater heights, and Greece consistently receives strong support from both Republicans and Democrats in our Congress. And as the US ambassador to Greece, this is a goal that I, along with my entire team, work to achieve every single day. Our relationship with Greece today spans the full range of geopolitical, security, economic, cultural, and educational cooperation, all of which is underpinned by our strategic dialogue, our recently updated mutual defense cooperation agreement, and our shared commitment to upholding democratic values. Last fall, in October, we completed our country's third strategic dialogue, in which we renewed our commitment to strengthening the relationship in key areas, including regional cooperation, defense and security, law enforcement and counterterrorism, trade investment, energy and environment, humanitarian challenges and disaster preparedness, and people-to-people ties. Our updated mutual defense cooperation agreement represents a commitment from both of our countries to deepen and expand our strategic defense relations. And it's important in this context to note that Greece has consistently exceeded NATO's 2% of GDP defense spending benchmark. The jewel in the crown of our defense cooperation is the US Navy base at Suda Bay, which is busier than it has been in many decades, not just because of its unique capabilities, but because of the great partnership we've built with the Hellenic Navy and Air Force that allows us to expand our operational cooperation. And we have made huge strides through our work with Greece to strengthen and open economic opportunities for both of our countries and to make Greece an attractive destination for international investment. Greece's recent reforms under the leadership of Prime Minister Mitsotakis and his team have led to a surge of US investment in Greece's tech sector. For example, Amazon Web Services selected Greece as one of 21 countries to launch what they call local zones in 2022. Microsoft's decision to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in a series of data centers around Athens is another marquee investment by a tech giant from the United States. Other leading American companies like Pfizer, Cisco, Digital Realty, Google, Deloitte, JP Morgan, and Applied Materials are expanding their footprint in Greece, reflecting new confidence in the future of Greece's economic recovery after a decade-long crisis and encouraging American industry leaders in other sectors to take a look at how Greece has changed and the superb human capital available here. Finally, speaking of human capital, I want to say a word about US-Greece people-to-people ties, which have been forged over 2 centuries of our country's shared commitment to defending and advancing our democratic values that were born right here in Athens. The ties between the peoples of our 2 countries add a special warmth to the relationship and bind us together. Our shared values are the foundation upon which these numerous areas of cooperation are built. We do not take these ties for granted. We know they have to be nurtured, which is why we dedicate so many resources to our public diplomacy programs that seek to bring Greeks and Americans together for dialogue that will deepen those ties and encourage us to learn from one another and share areas of expertise. And this is not just the effort of the US Embassy. The Greek Embassy in Washington and consulates across the United States are doing the same. Pantheon University promotes these ties through its annual American Studies seminar that our embassy has supported for more than 20 years. And the list of Fletcher School activities is very long, but of course I would start with its hosting of the prestigious Karamanlis Chair in Hellenic and European Studies. And even through the gatherings like this one today, we're promoting greater understanding between our peoples. So let me wind up where I started by coming back to Russia's activities on the Ukrainian border. In the face of Russia's aggression, the United States knows that we have a stable and committed NATO ally in Greece that will join all of its allies to respond, if necessary, if Russia chooses the confrontational path rather than the diplomatic way forward that we all hope to achieve. One of the ways that Russia employs to threaten Ukraine is a disinformation campaign that reflects a long-standing pattern that stretches back for decades. We know how the Kremlin creates multiple false realities and inserts confusion into the information environment when the truth is not in its interests. My boss, Secretary of State Blinken, recently called Russian disinformation one of the fundamental challenges of our time. To counter it, we must use all available means, as he said, to relentlessly and effectively tell our story. And that's why it's so important that as allies, we speak with one voice and in solidarity. To achieve that kind of solidarity takes an enormous amount of trust. And we've built trust with Greece by tending to our relationship through the slow and methodical work of diplomacy, which is something that has taken place over many decades. We've done this because we understand that deepening the US-Greece relationship is not only good for our 2 countries, but it makes NATO and all of our transatlantic institutions stronger. And we support Greece's regional and global foreign policy ambitions because we know they strengthen the rules-based international order upon which our collective prosperity and security depend. This is the heart of the complex diplomacy that we're talking about today. And with that, I want to thank you for your invitation, and I look forward to a dialogue and hearing everybody's questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for that tour de horizon in US-Greece relations. I'd like to open up to the questions. I would love to use the prerogative of a co-host to ask the first question, but I'll restrain myself and go to the audience questions first. And then maybe we can circle back for Professor Arvanitopoulos and me. The first question actually comes from a former Fletcher student who's a Fletcher alumnus now on the call, Constantine Arvanitopoulos. And he asks you, first, thank you for being at the Fletcher School. And he focused on transatlantic security in the business context, and he writes for Business Insider. He asks, how do you think the MDCA can develop further in the future? Specifically, are there prospects for the US military to operate from or help to develop military bases in the Aegean other than Crete?
So, good question. And I think, if you had asked me when I was getting ready to come here as ambassador, whether we were going to be operating at multiple new facilities beyond Suda Bay, or whether we would have concluded an extension of the MDCA, which will turn it into an indefinitely applied agreement, I would have said that was crazy. This was aspirational. So we have moved this defense and security relationship much farther than anyone thought possible when I came here as ambassador in 2016. So I'm not going to rule anything out. I can't rule anything in. We've taken a very big step by adding these additional hubs, and the most important ones are Alexandropoli, Larissa, and Volos Stepanovikio, all of which have different areas of focus and advantages. We are demonstrating through our continued investment in infrastructure and interoperability at those locations our commitment to being good guests. And the Greek government has demonstrated through its actions its confidence that this American military presence serves Greek interests. That's ultimately what's going to carry this process forward. It hinges on the confidence on both sides. And I would also emphasize that we're quite explicit when we decided on the additional facilities that we added to the MDCA last October, that we hold open the possibility of expanding it to future facilities, but we're not there yet. And I think we have to, first of all, consolidate the gains we've already reached. The agreement has to be passed in the Greek Parliament. That hasn't happened yet. And then we'll see where we go from there. But I have learned by working on these issues intently over the past 5.5 years, not to be shy about my own ambition in this area of cooperation.
Great, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. People are beginning to populate the Q&A. I'm going to try to do this in order as they come in. We have another question from Richard Jackson. I think maybe you're here at the Fletcher School. It says, when Russia came forward with its two concerns, demanding written responses vis-a-vis the Ukraine issue right now, did the United States give consideration to saying that we have concerns of our own and that we can share written responses? It says it might perhaps have put us on a more equal footing rather than it appearing that Russia is setting the agenda when it comes to Ukraine.
So that's exactly what we've tried to do. And as you've seen in the press, there's been an exchange of messages between Moscow and Washington on these issues. I would emphasize that the proposals that the United States has tabled and the areas of concern that we've identified have been meticulously coordinated with all of our NATO allies. We have been clear from the beginning of this process that this is not something that the United States and Russia are going to negotiate over the heads of the Ukrainians or even more over the heads of the Europeans. So we have raised concerns of our own about Russia's activities. We've also, as a NATO alliance, made very clear that there are certain expressed Russian concerns that are beyond the pale from our perspective. Most importantly, a firm commitment that the NATO Secretary General has reaffirmed repeatedly to maintaining the open door policy, and certainly an unwillingness to entertain suggestions from Moscow that there should be different qualities of NATO allies or different categories of NATO allies with those that are behind the former Iron Curtain And in the case of Greece's neighborhood in particular, the suggestion that there should be limits on NATO activities or foreign US military and NATO presence in Bulgaria and Romania. So, but it's been exactly as you described, the intent of the United States and all of our NATO allies to make clear both that there is a diplomatic path that can be pursued and that there are ideas that we're prepared to entertain in that context, but also that in this conversation, we will also come with our own areas of concern.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We now have a question, I think that's coming from Pantheon, from across the Atlantic, at least for us at home, for you right now. From Dimitris Nikas, he says, what role does the US expect for Greece to play? Does the US have expectations for Greece in terms of its role in the current Ukraine crisis? And I would add to that, and what are Greece's particular strategic and diplomatic advantages, perhaps, when it comes to the current Ukraine situation?
Yeah, both good questions. And I would say from an American standpoint, what we expect and what we hope of all of our NATO allies is, as I said in my remarks, that we will maintain unity of effort and unity of messaging. That was very much evident in the remarks of Foreign Minister Dendias yesterday. And that goes to also answer Professor Prodromou's question, because it's traveling to Mariupol. I am unaware of any other European foreign minister through this crisis period that has traveled to the front lines. And Mariupol is a city that was occupied by Russian-directed forces in 2014. It's a city where you can hear shelling every night. It is quite literally on the front lines. And I think Foreign Minister Dendias reflected a courageous and purposeful Greek diplomacy in doing so. And I also welcomed the degree to which he reminded us and reminded all of our European allies of Greece's historical connections to this part of the world. And I can remember when I was in Kyiv, I stayed very close to the Greek ambassador, and one of my Greek counterpart for the latter and majority of my time in Kyiv was a fabulous Greek diplomat who is today the diplomatic advisor to the President of the Republic. But Ambassador Papadopoulos always did me the favor of calling up when he had the Greek consul from Odessa and the Greek consul from Mariupol coming up for consultations in Kyiv. And he would point out that there was a lot of European diplomacy that was dominated by voices from France, from Germany, from Poland, from the UK, but none of those countries had the eyes on the ground that Greece enjoyed in the critical region along the Black Sea and Azov Sea coasts that are very much a focus of Russian influence efforts and are right in the crosshairs today. So Greece has considerable influence there. Another area of Greek influence and Greek leadership pertains to something that Professor Prodromou has worked on a lot, which is the role of the Greek Orthodox Church and the importance in the context of Greece's foreign policy, Athens' support for the authority and centrality of the ecumenical patriarch. And then in Ukraine, the really vital role of religion as one of the key elements of Ukrainian national identity that has become so much stronger since the Revolution of Dignity and since the invasion of Crimea. There are many manifestations of this. There was a terrific Wall Street Journal story over the weekend that focused on a women's fashion magazine, Elle, the Ukrainian edition of Elle, which has switched from writing in Russian, which was traditionally the language of sophisticated culture, to writing in Ukrainian. But it also, that Wall Street Journal article also quite properly focused on the enormous importance of the Patriarch's grant of Tomos to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and how that has reinforced the Ukrainian sense of national identity that is such an important part of the story of that country over the past 8 years.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and also for introducing here the importance of the salience of religion and culture as soft power tools that can either divide or bring, peace and cohesion in foreign policy. We have another question now from Philippos Krinis, I think, at Pantheon. Mr. Ambassador, Ambassador Pyatt, what is the possibility for the United States to ratify UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea Agreement, in order to push China as well as Turkey to abide by international rules and avoid their aggressive tactics against US allies and partners, both in the South China Sea and the Aegean Sea, Eastern Mediterranean? Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. I'm going to be very careful because I'm not a lawyer, and much less am I an international lawyer, and I get out of my depth very quickly on these issues. I will just note that this has been a difficult issue in US domestic politics. Repeated administrations have unsuccessfully sought the ratification of UNCLOS. I don't have a sense of what the political landscape at home on this looks like right now. But I would also note that our lawyers, our State Department lawyers, are very clear in terms of the customary law that is reflected in the UNCLOS and the degree to which that customary law should be binding on all of our international partners. So you've seen reference to this language, for instance, in my remarks and in Washington remarks about Turkey's claims as regards islands and the effect of islands in contrast to continental territory on maritime claims. There was also a very long and detailed US legal analysis, which was published by the State Department a few weeks ago. It's worth taking a look at, focusing in particular on the issue you alluded to, which is the South China Sea and Chinese claims around international maritime law there. So that's a very useful guidepost. And I think the lawyers in the room would tell you that when the United States makes a judgment on an issue like the Chinese claims in the South China Sea, those legal judgments can be precedential as well. So again, I refer you to that document. I think if you just search the State Department website, legal analysis, South China Sea, it should pop right up.
All right. I'm trying to go in order here. I'm going to jump to Dr. Charles Dallata, who says, I led the restructuring of Greece's debt in 2011-2012, the largest in history. It was, however, a devastating period for the Greek economy and the Greek people. Economic recovery is indeed underway, but Greece is still burdened by an enormous public sector debt, and bureaucratic inefficiencies. And indeed, youth unemployment continues to hover around 30%. Do you see that there's been sufficient change under the current Mitsotakis government for the Greek economy so that we can speak about a kind of, turning the corner, both practically and metaphorically?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would start by noting my fulsome agreement with your point about the devastating impact of the crisis decade and the social and sociological impacts of deferred marriage, people seeing their retirement funds evaporate, a country that lost 25% of its GDP, and the sort of psychological impact that had. What's fascinating to me, and I remember when I came to Greece and I arrived in the fall of 2016, and there was still huge uncertainty about whether Greece would fall out of the Eurozone, whether one of the systemic banks would collapse, whether Greece would fail to adhere to the very severe structural reform measures that the European Troika was demanding. What's remarkable to me is how nobody talks about those issues anymore. Greece truly has turned a corner in that regard. I think there's also something that's very hard to quantify, but I certainly feel it in meeting with Greek business people. There is a sense of renewed optimism about Greece's competitiveness, about Greece's economic future. There's a lot of lost ground that has to be made up for. But when you have these multi-hundred million dollar, multi-billion dollar deals being done, when you have whole new areas of economic growth that are emerging in the startup sector, in the knowledge-based economies. A company like Pfizer, which chooses Greece as a European hub because of the price competitiveness of the talent that's available here, because of its geographic location, which bridges East and West, Europe and Eurasia. It's been an education for me to talk to the people in the tech sector, and you ask, why are all these cloud computing centers coming up with Amazon and Microsoft and Digital Realty in Greece? And it turns out that even in the borderless world that we're talking on tonight, geography still matters in terms of where you put these cloud computing centers. And Greece has a particularly favorable location in terms of digital connectivity between Europe and Africa and the Middle East. So this has all become a new driver. Greece has substantially restructured its economy. And one of the really remarkable transformations that's happened over the past 2 years, even through the pandemic, has been the acceleration of digital governance. Greece had one of the lowest indices of digital services anywhere in Europe. And now, and let me see if I can open up my phone while I'm talking to you here for a second. I have something that none of my American colleagues have, which is my Greek digital, there, I can get it in focus if I'm careful. Anyway, this on my phone, I have a QR code that has all of my vaccination data. And so instead of the little piece of paper that we lose or gets all crumpled up in our purse, when I need to prove my vaccination status to get on an airplane or to go into a restaurant, I just pull out the QR code. And the really fascinating thing about this is this was the first one in the European Union. Greece was the first country in Europe to develop a digital vaccination certificate. It runs on an Amazon Web Services backbone. So it was built in close collaboration with American technology companies. And then the model was adapted by everybody else. So it goes to this point I alluded to in my remarks, that a Greece, which had acquired a reputation for being the poor performer of Europe, has suddenly become an example of good governance. A country that had a smart science-based approach to managing the pandemic, a country that had a very sophisticated digital rollout of its national vaccination program. And I remember talking to relatives in the United States who were constantly refreshing to try to get their vaccination appointments in the States. And the case of my family in Los Angeles, running off to Dodger Stadium or waiting in line at CVS when there was a rumor that new vaccine was available. Whereas in Greece, everybody was getting notified through their telephones with an algorithm that prioritized those who were medically vulnerable. So for instance, if you were in the Greek database as somebody who was being treated for diabetes because you had a prescription for your diabetes treatment, that would move you up in the algorithm. And so it was a push-based system to give people vaccinations. And I remember talking to Greek friends in the spring of last year when the vaccine was just being rolled out. And the first to be vaccinated in Greece, as in the US, were older people. And so these were a lot of younger folks who took their parents or grandparents to be vaccinated at these big government centers. And they all said to me, I never knew my government could do this. It was like a private sector enterprise. And it was vaguely miraculous, I think, for Greek citizens to see this. This same approach is being applied now to everything from business licenses to tax processing to driver's licenses. So it's a very exciting time, and it's good for the economy. It's good for competitiveness. It makes Greece a more attractive investment destination. Like every country in the world, every economy in the world, Greece faces a huge challenge in terms of growing out of the shock of the pandemic. Europe has a different approach to the economic stimulus that we had in the United States. Europe has a centrally managed recovery fund. That fund, Greece was the first EU member or Eurozone country to develop its European Recovery Fund program and have that approved. This is going to inject some 32 billion euros into the Greek economy over the next couple of years. That's a game-changing amount of resources. And Mitsotakis and his team are committed to the idea that those resources are going to be prioritized against targets like digital transformation, energy transition, social services that fit very well with the priorities of the United States in areas where we're competitive. So thank you for raising the question. It's a really important one, and certainly my perspective and what I see the market saying is that Greece has indeed turned a corner.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Just so keeping eye on time, by my clock, I think we have 14 minutes left to go. So if it's okay with you, and begging your indulgence, I'm going to begin combining some questions just so that we can try to get people's questions answered. We have
and I'll try to talk shorter.
No, this is wonderful. We have one from Shelby Sanger at the Fletcher School asking about ways that the United States and Greece are currently working together to address the migration phenomenon that Greece, as a an external border state of the EU, is confronting, and also a piece of the same question from Georgia Sadana, who I think is at Pantheon, asks, do you feel that NATO could or should be involved in the border security issues in the area of Alexandroupolis in terms of migration management as a transnational crisis?
So I would say no on the latter. I mean, the tool that's really fit for purpose in dealing with that is Frontex. And the mission, the challenge that Frontex faces on Greece's external frontiers is not that different from what the Department of Homeland Security confronts on our southwestern border. In both of our countries, we have issues of international law in terms of how we uphold our international obligations, the humanitarian concerns that go with that, but also not creating a pull factor and not creating a dynamic which encourages more people to put their lives at risk taking to the sea. I was just reading an article today about the increasing number of Colombians and others that the U.S. Coast Guard is picking up on their way to Florida. It's much the same in the Aegean. I am impressed. One of the points I make all the time is that we have to remember these are all human beings, and most of these migrants are just as much victims as anyone. They are people who have oftentimes been trafficked. They are paying traffickers to facilitate their movements, whether it's from South Asia, from Bangladesh, from Afghanistan. I once met some young women from Haiti in one of the refugee camps on Lesbos, who obviously had been trafficked there. They had traveled from Haiti to the Dominican Republic. They had flown from the Dominican Republic to Istanbul, and then they had been moved from Istanbul to the Turkish coast near Izmir, and they eventually found themselves on Lesbos. So how to manage that is a real challenge for our ages. It's a challenge for all of Europe. Greece has borne a disproportionate share of the European refugee challenge. And Europe as a whole, I think, faces a fundamental political issue. You see how divisive issues of migration and new arrivals have become in German politics, in French politics. In the case of the United States, we benefit from our founding myth that we are a melting pot, and our national ideology celebrates the idea of coming from elsewhere. There are a lot of countries in Europe that have not crossed that Rubicon. Certainly in the United States, we see that some of, look at how many Silicon Valley companies have been founded by first-generation immigrants, and how important immigration has been to revitalizing and making more dynamic some of our largest cities, New York being the foremost example of that. New York wouldn't exist without immigration. So Europe is still working on that, and I think Greece has done better than most in terms of demonstrating generosity towards these new arrivals. Interestingly for me, I think it's helped by the fact this year we are marking the the 100th anniversary of the transfer of populations between Asia Minor and Greece. So it's within living memory. Greek grandparents, know the stories of what it was like to be part of this tragic movement of people from Izmir to Athens, across Asia Minor and northern Greece as the populations were transferred. So I think that's helped the Greek debate, but again, none of us is perfect in this regard, and it's very important that Greece upholds its international obligations. In terms of the enforcement aspect of this, as I said, the right tool is definitely Frontex. This is why the European Union established that institution rather than NATO per se.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm going to combine two more questions, one from Kostas Pekinakis, who's a member of the IR theory group of IDIS and at Pantheon, and the other is from Vasilis Petropoulos, who's a first-year MALD Masters of Law and Diplomacy student at the Fletcher School. Both have to do with the Eastern Mediterranean. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being with us. How do you regard the situation in Cyprus and the East Med in terms of a post-Erdogan Turkey? Would you predict an easing of tensions and the beginning of a new era of cooperation in Greek-Turkish relations? And then the second piece of that, do you consider from Athens, do you consider the current economic situation of Turkey as a destabilizing factor in the broader Mediterranean region? And what role do you think that Greece can and should play in terms of trade and economics and overall stabilization in the East Med?
So on the Cyprus problem, let me confess that as a professional diplomat, I long ago gave away my crystal ball. I leave that to the academics because my job is to deal with the world as it is and to figure out how we position ourselves most effectively in that context. So I will defer any predictions about the future. Or as Yogi Berra said, the thing about the future is it's all unknown. Or something along those lines. I think on the question of Turkey and the economic situation, I think this is a hugely lucrative area of Greek diplomacy and Greek soft power. There is much potential for the positive agenda that Deputy Foreign Minister Fragogiannis and Deputy Minister Onal of Turkey are developing on everything from tariff rates to ferry schedules to recognition of COVID certificates. There are substantial complementarities between the two economies. There's also a cultural familiarity, and I remember before COVID, every time I would travel in the Eastern Aegean Islands during the summertime, if you go to Lesbos or Chios, the yacht marinas were all full of Turkish flagged vessels, and the ferries were full of people coming over from Turkey for vacation, sometimes just to come for a day or two, a long weekend. That is a soft power resource for Greece. And then you also had some substantial investments in Greece in key services sectors from Turkish industries. So I think it's a very wise approach that Greece has used to try to leverage that to advance its soft power influence in Turkey and to build the constituency in Turkey for a normal rules-based relationship with Greece. So that's my thought on that issue.
All right, great. One last combination of questions. We have a query about the climate crisis and climate disruption from Dylan Williams. The impact of climate disruption and climate change on the East Med. As climate alters the dimensions of geopolitics, what are the challenges and I would add opportunities for U.S.-Greek relations in managing climate disruption and change and in ensuring that the East Med environment in the broadest sense of the word.
Yeah, terrific question. And, I come from Southern California, and so many of the issues that we confront in Southern California are exactly the same that Greece faces here. The impact of ocean temperature change on fisheries, extreme weather events, wildfires, mudslides, all of the calamities that we've seen. The fact that we have in California, in the month of January, you had a major wildfire along the coast south of Monterey, even after a very wet and rainy late December and early January. This has never happened before. Similarly, the horrendous fires that Greece suffered last August, losing close to 10% of its forest cover. And at a time when there was real concern, you had 3 major fires that have broken out north of Athens on the island of Evia and around ancient Olympia. And there were real concerns that the fire around Athens was at risk of breaking through to industrial and urbanized areas of the city, which in fact, that's what drew off resources that allowed the fire in Evia in particular to grow so large. So we're all grappling with these challenges. The traditional methods for combating these kind of wildfires are not up to the dimensions of the problem now. So we have a very good program of cooperation that we've begun to develop between the Greek Ministry of Civil Protection and the FEMA and USAID and the US Forest Service to exchange expertise on these phenomena. And then I would also highlight the really important leadership that Prime Minister Mitsotakis has exercised in the area of climate change and energy transition in particular. Greece's decision to phase out coal on an accelerated basis, much faster than many others in Europe have been willing to do. Greece's concerted effort to prioritize new investment in new infrastructure in wind and solar, which are areas where Greece historically was underinvested and obviously has an enormous resource endowment to be developed. Here too, you're seeing good collaboration between American companies and Greek counterparts. You actually have an American fossil fuels company out of Texas called 547 Energy, which is in the final licensing phase of what will become the largest onshore wind power project in all of Greece. It's amazing to me, having spent a lot of time flying over this country, to see how extensive the wind power infrastructure has become. And I think the next phase, which the United States will want to partner in, is offshore wind. Interestingly, you also have a Greek company, Corinth Cables, is actually providing the cabling for the first major offshore wind project in the United States, which is east of Virginia. So you see how the business and investment synergies are also working there as well.
All right, well, thank you. I see that we have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to turn it over to Professor Arvanitopoulos, not before saying that I lament not being able to ask you about the similarities between Russia and Turkey when it comes to divergence of values and divergence of interests, both in terms of soft power, disinformation, and the use of religious diplomacy for purposes of disruption. But not being able to ask you that question, I will turn it over to Professor Arvanitopoulos and ask him to close. And again, thank you for your indulgence with all of our questions and for being with us today. Constantine?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Ambassador, for your thoughtful remarks and for covering such a wide range of subjects, from Ukraine to climate change. And let me highlight 2 or 3 takeaways for our students. I think the one has to do with Russian aggression in Ukraine, and I think what you highlighted as being at stake is not just another crisis, but I think that Russia is threatening the post-Cold War settlement, our values and principles that have to do with democracy and freedom, and the liberal order in Europe and elsewhere. And I think, as you highlighted, there are 2 main avenues for Russia. One is, negotiations and a peaceful settlement of the crisis, and the other, of course, is the road of aggression that will bring the united West against Russian aggression in terms of harsh economic sanctions, but also a number of other measures that the West united from Washington to Brussels to Athens can take against Russia to counter Russian aggression. And I think that the second very important takeaway is what you have described as Greece's transformation over the last years. And this is particularly, it's very hopeful and helpful for Greeks to listen to a very objective look at what has happened in Greece over the last years. And I think that it's so true that Greece stopped being part of the problems in the region, and it has become part of the solutions in the region, highlighted by the Prespes agreement with North Macedonia, and also getting out of the economic crisis and trying to get into a mode of growth and development. And I think that I would particularly stay on your comment on Thessaloniki. Now, Thessaloniki is actually tending to become a gateway for trade, investment, and become again a cosmopolitan center that it used to be. And I think that I know your how much you care about that subject and how much you've done to contribute to that and make Thessaloniki, as the government has tried to do, a center for foreign investment and growth, not only for Greece, but for the wider region. And finally, I will come to your perception of Greece's foreign policy changes and how Greece today can play a constructive and leading role in many regions, not only in Europe, being a member state, but also in Africa, in the Middle East, in East Med, and so on and so forth. And you mentioned the 3+1 framework that we set together with Israel and the United States and Cyprus, and also welcoming Egypt and trying to promote peace, stability, and a number of economic and energy agreements that are win-win agreements. They are not meant to exclude any of our East Med neighbors. And finally, your conceptualization of Greek-Turkish differences, and I think we can all agree that it is to our common interest that Turkey maintains its Western orientation in its foreign policy and remains anchored in Western institutions. I think that that has always been one of the objectives of Greek foreign policy, regardless of which government was in power, for obvious reasons. And I think that this remains the case. And finally, I think that I will close with thanking you for what you have done for bilateral relations, both in the areas of defense and the areas of foreign investment, and also for fostering people-to-people relations. I think it is fair to say that Greek-American relations have never been better. And to a large extent, we owe that to your very active role and engagement on many issues. And I want to thank you for your service, and also thank you for agreeing to do that. It means a lot for our students in Greece, but also here at Fletcher. Thank you, Ambassador, very much. Great,
thank you. Thanks for the platform. I hope we can continue the conversation one way or another, and please do, continue the effort to build and deepen this partnership, because it is of strategic importance to the United States, and it's not something that we should take for granted. And as you alluded to, Professor, it's not something that happened through gravity. It took a concerted, systematic effort through a series of presidential administrations to get us where we are today. And it behooves us all to continue and to reaffirm that investment.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Mr. Ambassador, and thanks to everyone for being with us.
Yeah, thanks. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
You too.
Thank you.